All right, y'all, we're good to go. So start. I appreciate y'all for joining me for this reading of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. If you don't have a copy of the book physically, or if you haven't found a PDF for yourself yet, there is a PDF right in the pin section of this Discord channel for y'all, so y'all can go ahead and grab that. Um, these sessions are going to be private. That's why I ended up doing it the way I do it. I hold public readings on Monday nights, Wednesday nights, and Saturday afternoons. But I had decided I was going to read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa on my own, but decided there might be folks who want to join me, which ended up being a little bit of an understatement from the looks of it. So that's good. How we do it is we literally just get on here, read together, pause to share our thoughts, then open it up to other folks who might want to take over some of the reading for a little while and just keep the conversation going like that. As soon as I have the PDF pulled up on my own screen, we'll be good to go. The preface: How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney, 1973. This book derives from a concern with the contemporary African situation. It delves into the past only because otherwise it would be impossible to understand how the present came into being and what the trends are for the near future. In the search for an understanding of what is now called underdevelopment in Africa, the limits of inquiry have had to be fixed as far apart as the 15th century on the one hand, and on the end of the colonial period on the other hand. Ideally, an analysis of underdevelopment should come even closer to the present than the end of the colonial period in the 1960s. The phenomenon of neocolonialism cries out for extensive investigation in order to formulate the strategy and tactics of African emancipation and development. This study does not go that far, but at least certain solutions are implicit in a correct historical evaluation. Just as giving medical remedies are indicated or contraindicated by a correct diagnosis of a patient's condition and an accurate case history. Hopefully, the facts and interpretation that follow will make a small contribution toward reinforcing the conclusion that African development is possible only on the basis of a radical break with the international capitalist system, which has been the principal agency of underdevelopment of Africa over the last 5 centuries. As the reader will observe, the question of development strategy is tackled briefly in the final section by Ayon Babu, a former Minister of Economic Affairs and Development Planning, who has been actively involved in fashioning policy along those lines in the Tanzanian context. It is no accident that the text as a whole has been written within Tanzania, where expressions of concern for development have been accompanied by considerably more positive action than in several other parts of the continent. Many colleagues and comrades share in the preparation of this work. Special thanks must go to comrades Kareem Herji and Henry Mapalu of the University of Dar es Salaam, who read the manuscript in the spirit of constructive criticism. But contrary to the fashion in most prefaces, I will not add that, quote, all mistakes and shortcomings are entirely my responsibility, close quote. That is sheer bourgeois subjectivism. Responsibility in matters of these sorts is always collective, especially with regard to the remedying of shortcomings. My thanks also go to the Tanzania Publishing House and Blackley Le Obitier Publications for cooperating and producing this volume as simply and cheaply as possible. The purpose has been to try and reach Africans who wish to further explore the nature of their exploitation, rather than to satisfy the standards set by our oppressors and their spokesmen in the academic world. So that was the preface. They're going to show us how, up to that point, the capitalist world had, been underdeveloping Africa. They say what was the direct quote that he had there? An analysis of underdevelopment should come even closer to the present than the end of the colonial period in the 1960s. And remedying this requires a radical break with the international capitalist system, which had been the principal agency of underdevelopment of Africa over the last 5 centuries, up to the point that this work released. So it'll be real good to learn about this history of underdevelopment, which I'm looking forward to. Chapter 1, some questions on development. In contrast with the surging growth of the countries in our socialist camp and the development taking place, albeit much more slowly, in the majority of the capitalist countries, it is the unquestionable fact that a large proportion of the so-called underdeveloped countries are in total stagnation, and that in some of them the rate of economic growth is lower than that of population increase. These characteristics are not fortuitous. They correspond strictly to the nature of the capitalist system and full expansion, which transfers to the dependent countries the most abusive and barefaced forms of exploitation. It must be clearly understood that the only way to solve the questions now besetting mankind is to eliminate completely the exploitation of dependent countries by developed capitalist countries, with all the consequences that this implies. And that's a quote from Che Guevara in 1964. And let me just make sure to remind y'all that when it's time to open it up to discussion, you can type stack in the chat and I'll call on you in order of the stack comments. That's how we make sure people don't end up talking over each other and everybody gets to say their piece. So y'all make sure y'all are doing that. We should be good. Now, what is development? Development in human society is a many-sided process. At the level of the individual, it implies increased skill and capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. That's already pretty loaded. Some of these are virtually moral categories and are difficult to evaluate depending on, as they do, on the age in which one's lives, one's class origins, and one's personal code of what is right and what is wrong. However, what is indisputable is that the achievement of any of those aspects of personal development is very much tied in with the state of the society as a whole. From earliest times, man found it convenient and necessary to come together in groups to hunt and for the sake of survival. The relations which develop within any given social group are crucial to an understanding of the society as a whole. Freedom, responsibility, skill, etc. have real meaning only in terms of the relations of men in society. Of course, each social group comes into contact with others. The relations between individuals in any two societies are regulated by the form of the two societies. Their respective political structures are important because the ruling elements within each group are the ones that begin to dialogue, trade, or fight, as the case may be. At the level of social groups, therefore, development implies an increasing capacity to regulate both internal and external relationships. Much of human history has been a fight for survival against natural hazards and against real and imagined human enemies. Okay. The development in the past has always meant the increase in the ability to guard the independence of the social group and indeed to infringe upon the freedom of others, something that often came about irrespective of the will of the persons within the societies involved. Men are not the only beings which operate in groups, but the human species embarked upon a unique line of development because men had the capacity to make and use tools. The very act of making tools was a stimulus to increasing rationality rather than the consequence of a fully matured intellect. In historical terms, man the worker was every bit as important as man the thinker, because the work with tools liberated man from sheer physical necessity so that he can impose himself upon other more powerful species and upon nature itself. The tools with which men work and the manner in which they organize their labor are both important indices of social development. More often than not, The term social development is used in an exclusive economic sense, the justification being that the type of economy is itself an index of other social features. What then is economic development? A society develops economically as its members increase jointly their capacity for dealing with the environment. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature, science, and on the extent to which they put the understanding into practice by devising tools, technology, and on the manner in which work is organized. Taking a long-term view, it could be said that there has been constant economic development within human society since the origins of man, because man has multiplied enormously his capacity to win a living from nature. The magnitude of man's achievement is best understood by reflecting on the early history of human society and noting, firstly, the progress from crude stone tools to the use of metals. Secondly, the changeover from hunting and gathering wild fruit to the domestication of animals and the growing of food crops. And thirdly, the improvement in the character of work from being an individualistic activity towards an activity which assumes a social character through the participation of many. So we can pause for a little bit to discuss this, because he has some pretty interesting things to say about, especially when it comes to some of these definitions. So he says, what then is economic development? A society develops economically as its members increase jointly their capacity for dealing with the environment. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature, science, on the extent to which they put the understanding into practice by devising tools, technology, and on the manner in which work is organized. So what we have here is a clear understanding that work itself gets organized not only according to the people's understanding of the material conditions in the region in which they must labor, but also in their ability to develop tools in order to be able to address the material conditions for the region in which they're laboring. So you can't divorce that relationship from each other. Otherwise, you'll just have unorganized labor and quite literally nothing getting done. What are some examples y'all might think of labor and tools that might be needed to be used in one context that if you tried to use them in a different context would not get the job done at all?
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, so what are some examples of tools that if you were to use them for one kind of material condition in order to do a job, if you were to try to use them in another, it wouldn't work at all? What are some examples y'all can think of for that? See, got Captain ACAB typing, and while they're typing, guns come to mind. How do you mean, Captain ACAB?
I just mean in that, like, there are a lot of people that I see, I mean, not necessarily in the context of helping society, but like right now specifically, people tend to put priorities on one specific thing instead of branching out and using the appropriate tool. So people will be like, oh yeah, let's just use guns to protect ourselves from everything, but that's not a good strategy. You have to use the appropriate tool.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that is a good example.
Community defense being about like the community, building community, and not just the defense part necessarily physically, but defending from all things. So people have to come together and use things correctly.
That's a really good example. It reminds me of how Mao talks about one of the contradictions in the USSR being that they dealt with the inside contradictions in the very same way that they dealt with the imperialistic forces that were imposing outside contradictions, and how that was inappropriate. You don't deal with comrades and your own people in the same exact way. You would deal with people that are not your people and who do not necessarily have your nation's best interest in mind. You'll end up dealing with violence situations that could have very well been dealt with through the public sphere, diplomatically, etc. So that's a really good example. Eleonora.
I was going to say food, specifically food processing tools, because if the material conditions do not require or necessitate that food is a resource that is sparse, and or the production of food is for commodification rather than the sustenance of the people, then it is able to be used as a token rather than as an actual means for progressing the needs addressing the needs that the people have.
Exactly. Yeah. No, there's different regions definitely require different different production quantities. And I mean, we've seen this before too, being used against developing nations. We have examples, like for example, grain was a resource in the USSR, and they were having to export it during a time where they really couldn't afford to export it because sanctions were being placed on the other different resources that they could have been exported. And as such, they ended up having to produce even more grain than what was, what's the word I'm looking for, advisable. And as such, that led to deficiencies and developing the industrial aspect of the economy. So like these things don't even necessarily, they're not divorced from each other. They have a relationship to each other. When you're putting productive forces toward one aspect of development and taking them away from another aspect of development that has very real material consequences, as we've seen time and time again. So yeah, that's a really good example. Dread Hampton. I love that name, by the way, comrade.
Appreciate it. I'm not sure if it's completely what you were asking, but organizing with the intent to isolate. So like gathering a group of people to try and make something independent and maybe focused along communist lines, but with the intent to only help yourselves and no one else.
Exactly. Yeah, that goes to just the community aspect that was being mentioned earlier by the comrade, where we end up trying to put to the individual problems that ought to be solved collectively and with joint labor. So yeah, that's wow. It's very much, that answers very much in the spirit of the question. The people's ability to think together is a very real resource that we don't often utilize in the most efficient way, and to many times in history, brutal results. So yeah, that's good shit, comrade. I appreciate that answer. Let's continue on. So every people have shown a capacity for independently increasing their ability to live a more satisfactory life through exploiting the resources of nature. Every continent independently participated in the early epochs of the extension of man's control over his environment, which means in effect that every continent can point to a period of economic development. Africa, being the original home of man, was a major participant in the process in which human groups display an ever-increasing capacity to extract a living from the natural environment. Give me a second. Indeed, in the early period, Africa was the focus of the physical development of man, as such as distinct from other living beings. Development was universal because the conditions leading each economic expansion were universal. Everywhere, man was faced with the task of survival by meeting fundamental material needs, and better tools were a consequence of the interplay between human beings and nature as part of the struggle for survival. Of course, human history is not a record of advances and nothing else. There were periods in every part of the world when there were temporary setbacks and actual reduction of the capacity to produce basic necessities and other services for the population. But the overall tendency was towards increased production, and at given points of time, the increase in the quantity of goods was associated with the change in the quality or character of society. This will be shown later with reference to Africa, but to indicate the universal application of the principle of qualitative change, an example will be drawn from China. Early man in China lived at the mercy of nature and slowly discovered such basic things as the fact that fire can be man-made, and that seeds of some grasses could be planted into the soil to meet food requirements. Those discoveries helped inhabitants of China to have simple farming communities using stone tools and producing enough for bare subsistence. That was achieved several thousand years before the birth of Christ or the flight of the Prophet Muhammad. The goods produced at that stage were, the goods produced at that stage were divided more equally among the members of society who lived and worked in families. By the time of the Tang Dynasty of the 7th century AD, China had expanded its economic capacity not only to grow more food, but also to manufacture a wide variety of terms such as silks, porcelain, ships, and scientific devices. This, of course, represented This, of course, represented a quantitative increase in the goods produced. And it was interrelated with qualitative changes in Chinese society. By the later date, there was a political state where before there were only self-government units. Instead of every family and every individual performing the task of agriculturalists, house builders, tailors, there had arisen specialization of function. Most of the population, still tilled the land, but there were skilled artisans who made silk and porcelain, bureaucrats who administered the state, and Buddhist and Confucian religious philosophers who specialized in trying to explain those things that lay outside of immediate understanding. Specialization and division of labor led to more production as well as inequality in distribution. A small section of Chinese society came to take a large disproportionate share of the proceeds of human labor, and that was the section which did least to actually generate wealth by working in agriculture or industry. They could afford to do so because grave inequalities had emerged in the ownership of the basic means of production, which was the land. Family land became smaller as far as more peasants were concerned, and a minority took over the greater portion of the land. Those changes in land tenure were part and parcel of development in its broadest sense. That is why development cannot be seen purely as an economic affair, but rather as an overall social process which is dependent upon the outcomes of man's efforts to deal with his natural environment. Okay. Through careful study, it is possible to comprehend some of the very complicated links between the changes in the economic base and changes in the rest of the superstructure of the society, including the sphere of ideology and social beliefs. Cool. The changeover from communism in Asia and Europe led, for instances, to codes of behavior peculiar to feudalism. The conduct of the European knights in armor had much in common with that of the Japanese samurai or warriors. They developed notions of so-called chivalry. Conduct becoming a gentleman knight on horseback, while in contrast, had to learn extreme humility, deference, and obsequiousness. Because somebody posted a definition for that one in the chat. Appreciate it. Symbolized by doffing his cap and standing bare-headed before his superiors. In Africa, too, it was to be found that the rise of the state and superior classes led to the practice whereby common subjects prostrated themselves in the presence of the monarchs and aristocrats. When the point had been reached, it became clear that the rough equality of the family had given way to a new state of society. Okay. We could talk about this one too. So, the most interesting part that I found up here is when he was saying, what was that quote? This is why development cannot be seen purely as an economic affair, but rather as an overall social process. which is dependent upon the outcome of man's efforts to deal with his natural environment. So I'm thinking about that from the perspective of it's not just the economic affair where you're talking about job creation and the development of the productive forces and all that good shit, but we're also talking about the literal relations between the people and how the deterioration of those relations or the improvement of those relations can have an effect on the quality of the labor being done around you. It can have an effect on the context in which you're laboring in order to improve your situation in the first place. So that's a very important point that I don't think necessarily gets brought up enough. Appreciate y'all. Obsequious, obedient or attentive to an excessive or servile degree. Awesome. Full of or exhibiting servile compliance, fawning. Funereal, pertaining to funeral rites, absorbed in grief as a mourner at a funeral. I don't think they was using that definition. So yeah, we always gotta make sure that when we're talking about the material conditions of a nation, the relationships between the people of that nation is a very real factor that you have to consider when thinking about how that nation is supposed to develop productively. So that's a very important point, and I don't think I've ever actually heard that brought up before here, but it's something I've thought about, and probably y'all too, I imagine. So that's good shit. Did anybody else want to read for a bit, or I can continue? It's up to y'all for real.
I could read.
Awesome.
In the natural sciences, it is well known that in many instances, quantitative changes become qualitative after a certain period. The common example is the way that water can absorb heat, a quantitative process, until it is at 100 degrees Celsius. It changes to steam, a qualitative change of form. Similarly, in human society, it has always been the case that the expansion of the economy leads eventually to a change in the form of social relations. Karl Marx, writing in the 19th century, is the first writer to appreciate this, and he distinguished within European history several stages of development. The first major stage, following after simple bands of hunters, was communalism, where property was collectively owned, work was done in common, and goods were shared equally. The second was slavery, caused by the extension of domineering elements within the family and by some groups being physically overwhelmed by others. Slaves did a variety of tasks, but their main job was to produce food. The next stage was feudalism, where agriculture remained the principal means of making a livelihood, but the land which was necessary for that purpose was in the hands of the few, and they took the lion's share of the wealth. The workers on the lands, now called serfs, were no longer the personal property of the masters, but were tied to the land of a particular manor or estate. When the manor changed hands, the serfs had to remain there and provide goods for the landlord, just keeping enough to feed themselves. Just as the child of a slave was also a slave, so the children of serfs were also serfs. Then came capitalism, under which the greatest wealth in the society was produced not in agriculture, but by machines, in factories and in mines. Like the preceding phase of feudalism, capitalism was characterized by the concentration in the hands of ownership by a few. Concentration in a few hands of ownership by the means of producing wealth and by unequal distribution of the products of human labor. The few who dominated were the bourgeoisie, who had originated in the merchants and craftsmen of the feudal epoch, and whose rose to be industrialists and financiers. Meanwhile, the serfs were declared legally free to leave the land and go in search of employment in capitalist enterprises. Their labor thereby became a commodity, something to be bought and sold.
So that's already some pretty interesting stuff the comrade was just reading there, especially at the end when they're talking about their labor therefore thereby became a commodity, something to be bought and sold. Now, it's to be noted that this was considered quote unquote progress under bourgeois democracy, where at the very least your ability to labor became something that was in your hands from the standpoint that, oh, if you can so-called quote unquote market yourself and pitch yourself to the capitalist as somebody who could turn a profit on their behalf, you can go ahead and labor under conditions that you and the capitalist agree upon. The situation, of course, practically ended up playing out that oftentimes you ended up being entering into an exploitative relationship anyways, because the situation, while technically a negotiation, was really just capitalist coercion of people who had to accept what labor there was to do in order to be able to make ends meet. And we've seen this relation to labor continue on throughout the years. How many of us have taken jobs that we quite literally felt like, I gotta work this job, I gotta eat, I got people to feed. So that's a pretty important point they were bringing up there. Eleonora.
Yeah, I think the next section talks about this a little bit, but just a pseudo-tangential point, but I think this is very interesting when contextualized in the context of the Americas, and how these serfs who were declared free and given the promise of land were instilled this deeply capitalist mindset and then isolated in a place where they were now the exploiter.
That's a really good point. Could you expand on it a little bit?
Yeah, so in the context of European colonialism, if you think about what were the promises, what led to people leaving Europe to participate in colonial conquest for the people at the top in the colonial empires themselves. And generally, it is the either petit bourgeois who are owning of small business, or they are people who were in the working class but not necessarily poor. The vast majority leaving were, I think it was like 20% of Europeans who actually left were poor. They either left for religious reasons or etc. And so they are the type of people who realized that their position was stagnant, and they saw an opportunity rather than having class consciousness and coming together. They decided to go out and exploit and recreate the oppressive system in a much worse way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You're talking about just this situation that Fanon's talking about over in Wretched of the Earth, where the not necessarily the colonized, but oppressed workers themselves can find themselves with an opportunity to change relations in such a way that they themselves can build a system that they can benefit from. This is something that we can observe with something like the American Revolution, where they broke away from England, over disagreements about slavery, just to be able to do an even worse chattel slavery over here and what is so-called the Americas. So yeah, that's a really good point, how these people will, under the supposed context of them being exploited, end up developing a system that is oftentimes even worse than the one they call themselves breaking away from. So yeah, that's very observable. I appreciate you bringing up that point. Dread Hampton, what's good?
The way the author showed each stage, it felt like it's like you start off free, and then you go to slavery and you're restrained to a person. And then you go to feudalism, you're restrained to land, so it's getting more abstract. And then you go to capitalism, and they say you're not restrained, but you're coerced into everything. So it's just a restraint with more steps. And it just makes me think that like whatever they try to do next, it'll just be like, oh no, you're free. You just have to do X, Y, Z. before you get to, you know, profit or not profit, but take in any of the value you're creating. It just seems more and more abstract and plotted as opposed to just, I mean, I know it's material forces and whatnot, but it just feels like over time they're like, oh, here's shackles, but we'll make it better so you'll feel like you're getting freedom, but you're still restrained.
Exactly. And to expand on your point, Fieldy in the chat said slavery, direct ownership of humans; feudalism, ownership of humans via the land they labor on; capitalism, ownership of humans via purchase of their labor. So you see that as new systems continue to pop up, none of these systems ever actually guarantee you freedom. They're just simply changing the on paper contextual relationship that you have to the person who is going to be exploiting your labor. So you're still being robbed and stolen from, but they'll change the name or they'll change the context. And so in the case of the United States, we know the very obvious example of like, oh, we can't do slavery anymore in any direct way, but if we like put every damn thing that happens in the hood and call it a crime, and then make the amendment say that criminality is the only context in which you might enslave a person, we can continue to keep slavery going almost to the same extent that it was going on under chattel slavery. So yeah, even the material relationship doesn't even go away in society. They just change the context on which they might implement that kind of system. So yeah, you're spot on with that one, comrade. I appreciate you bringing up that point. Saber, what's good, bro?
Yeah. All right. One thing that's coming to mind as I read this last section right here, and how he talks about the major epochs of human society. And I'm kind of relating that to the section just before it, where he also talks about how these kinds of developments can also impact or change the sphere of like ideology and social belief. So, if you're looking at a society that has been developing for centuries or thousands of years, going through that process of developing their social beliefs and their ideologies in tandem with the land that they live on and stuff like that. If you all of a sudden have this other group of people, for instance, you can use the colonial period as an example. If they just show up and they're like, all right, this is our land now. All of it belongs to us. Your cultures, your languages are all going to get destroyed, blah, blah, blah. All of that knowledge that has been embedded into the sphere of ideology and social beliefs, or like religions and languages and other kinds of things, even dances as well, ways of specific kinds of like working the land, all of that's also going to get erased as well as you colonize people. So that's something that came to mind as I was reading that.
I appreciate that, comrade. Yeah, that's a really strong point. The relationship and the way it changes is oftentimes like y'all were just saying. It doesn't even end up bearing itself out different from the perspective of the colonized person. All that ends up happening is kind of what Dred Hampton was saying, where you feel the shackles a little bit looser on your wrist, but you're still shackled. You're still not free. You're still having to be exploited and sell your labor in a way that almost entirely divorces you from any kind of concept of freedom. I remember when has it been 6 years already? Yeah, it's been 6 years already when marriage equality became the law of the states. Clarence Thomas was out here talking about, oh yeah, that that's wrong, and you can't say that we have to do marriage equality in order to give these people dignity, because the government never took their dignity from them in the first place, because the government can't grant dignity. And he made this argument on behalf of both LGBTQ people and former slaves, saying that it's not dignity that was granted to former slaves, and as such it's not something that you gain simply from being free. And it just lets you know, like, the people inside this system very much operate from the standpoint that not only do they not owe you freedom, but they're not even from their own viewpoint robbing you of it in the first place because it's not theirs to give. So they call themselves, benevolent capitalists or benevolent, feudal lords or benevolent, even slave owners in some cases, thinking to themselves like, well, I'm like having a better relationship to them than the person over here. Therefore, there's nothing fundamentally wrong. I'm not robbing them of their dignity. I'm giving them more dignity than the next motherfucker, which is just totally, obviously divorced from reality. But this is quite literally the way these people think. It's fundamentally, disgusting, quite literally. But we really dealing with motherfuckers like that. We gonna have to do something about them at some point. What we got here? The alienation allowed for the justification, despite knowing their wrongness. They participated anyway, and mean to remove themselves from viewing the atrocity committed at their word happening before them. That's exactly it, comrade. All right, Dre Hampton, if you want to go for a little bit, I appreciate that. Then Comrade Gonzalo can go.
Sure. It was predicted that there would be a further stage, that of socialism, in which the principle of economic equality would be restored, as in communalism. In the present century, the phase of socialism has indeed emerged in some countries. Economically, each succeeding stage represented development in the strict sense that there was increased capacity to control the material environment and thereby to create more goods and services for the community. The greater quantity of goods and services were based on greater skills and human inventiveness. Man was liberated in the sense of having more opportunities to display and develop his talents. Whether man uplifted himself in a moral sense is open to dispute. The advance in production increased the range of powers which sections of society had over other sections, and it multiplied the violence which was part of the competition for survival and growth among social groups. It is not at all clear that a soldier serving capitalism in the last World War was less primitive in the elemental sense of the word than a soldier serving in one of Japan's feudal armies in the 16th century, or for that matter, than a hunter living in the first phase of human organization in the forest of Brazil. Nevertheless, we do know that in those three respective epochs, hunting, hand, feudalism, capitalism, the quality of life improved. It became less hazardous and less uncertain, and members of society potentially had greater choice over their destinies. All of that is involved when the word development is used. In the history of those societies which have passed through several modes of production, the opportunity is presented of seeing how quantitative changes give rise ultimately to an entirely different society. The key feature is that at given junctures, the social relations in the society were no longer effective in promoting advance. Indeed, they began to act as brakes on the productive forces and therefore had to be discarded. Take, for instance, the epoch of slavery in Europe. However morally indefensible slavery may have been, it did serve for a while to open up the mines and agricultural plantations in large parts of Europe and notably within the Roman Empire. But then those peasants who remained free had their labor depressed and underutilized because of the presence of slaves. The slaves were not disposed to work at any tasks requiring skills, so the technological evolution of society threatened to come to a halt. Furthermore, the slaves were restless and slave revolts were expensive to put down. The landowners, seeing their estates going to ruin, decided that it would be best to grant the legal freedom for which slaves were clamoring, and to keep exploiting the labor of these free serfs by ensuring that they had no lands to plow other than those of the landlords. Thereby, a new set of social relations, that of landlord and serf, replaced the old relations of slave master and slave. In some, good. Was that a stopping point or? Okay. In some instances, the change over to a new mode was accompanied by violence at a critical point. This occurred when the ruling classes involved were being threatened with removal by the process of change. The feudal landlords remained in power for centuries, during which the merchant and manufacturing interests grew wealthy and sought to achieve political power and social preeminence. When classes are so well defined, their consciousness is at a high level. Both the landlord class and the capitalists recognized what was at stake. The former fought to hold on to the social relations which no longer corresponded to the new technology of machine production and the organization of work by means of purchasing labor power. The capitalists flung themselves into revolutions in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries to break the old relations of production. The notions of revolution and class consciousness must be borne in mind when it comes to examining the situation of the modern worker and peasant classes in Africa. However, for the greater part of Africa's history, the existing classes have been incompletely crystallized, and the changes have been gradual rather than revolutionary. What is probably of more relevance for early African development is the principle that development over the world's territories has always been uneven.
That's a good stopping point, comrade. I appreciate you. So, yeah, they had a lot to say in that, even in that section. So, what was the one that had caught my eye? Where was it at? The advance in production increased the range of powers which sections of society had over other sections, and it multiplied the violence, which is part of the competition for survival and growth among social groups. So they're quite literally talking about how literally an increase in the productive forces, which we can imagine is attributed to the development of technology and new laborious techniques, quite literally only end up benefiting the exploiters. You end up, how many times do you talk to other workers about, man, if we could do this at this job, that would make this job easier, or if you could do this at that job, that would make this job easier. But you don't end up, once they find a way to make things work more efficiently, end up with a better work situation. If anything, you find yourself working more hours for the same low pay, while at the same time the capitalist or the exploiter, depending on the system of economics, continues to be able to exploit you more and more, and there's more and more to steal. So you increase your productivity via whatever advancement has been made, but you see no benefits of it other than your body breaking down more, and you seeing a slightly bigger paycheck depending on the relation, from the more hours you're having to work. But there's been no real change to your material situation, while you just made this other motherfucker over here richer. It's ironic how that works. Things get easier for us, but only somebody else benefits. Saber.
Yeah, I like how he kind of pushes back against the notion that slaves or enslaved Africans were freed because of some kind of like moral realization, like, oh my god, we finally after all these centuries realized that slavery bad. Like, no, this is very illustrated by when he says, the slaves are restless, slave revolts were expensive to put down. The landowners, seeing their estates going to ruin, decided that it would be best to grant the legal freedom for which slaves were clamoring. So, and so like, as we'll see as the book goes on, even after this period of the transatlantic slave trade had ended, as you move into the colonial period, in many places the conditions aren't even better. on the continent, much less the conditions that Africans in America were dealing with after the Emancipation Proclamation. So that was an interesting thing that I picked up from that last section.
I appreciate that, comrade. Yeah, that's a very good point. We'll touch on that in a little bit. Eleonora.
I think the last bit is particularly interesting to me. So, however, for the greater part of Africa's history, the existing classes have been incompletely crystallized, and the great changes have been gradual rather than revolutionary. And I think this is interesting because if you really consider the historical context of the colonization of Africa, it is, in essence, the perfection of colonialism by the European empires, and it pervades in everywhere that isn't Europe much more strongly. And so, despite there being strong contradictions in those areas, this effect of preventing class consciousness by blurring the lines of where the classes start and begin is something that we see to this day in pretty much every colonized area.
Absolutely. It ties in with what they were saying before. What was the one quote? Basically how he was alluding to, okay, the freedom being clamored for by the slaves, we'll grant that to them while we'll exploit the serfs even more. And how this relationship ends up just playing out through history from the standpoint of like, oh, we'll give you concessions that aren't even really concessions, because when you find yourself with this new so-called freedom and an inability to make your material conditions better on your own, since there's quite literally no land to labor on, as was being mentioned, you find yourself having to enter right back into an exploitative relationship in the first place. So while on paper, yeah, your freedom was granted to you, in actuality, it's out of the frying pan and into the fire, because you're still gonna have to enter into some system of exploitation just to keep the equivalent of the bills being paid, no matter what time in history and no matter at what point of development you're talking about. That's which is why we call history the history a class struggle, because that's quite literally what it is. And there's never really been a point in history where one motherfucker isn't being exploited by a significantly worse motherfucker. So yeah, that's a good point. They were bringing up.
And more specifically, I think the international aspect of the struggle is something we can't forget, because if you think about these systems and these lines being blurred, this alienation and this level of line blurring is a powerful tool in how we are able to reproduce the same systems, not just on a local level, but also as the formation of countries causes need for resources, and those countries exploit other countries. So if you look at the many countries of Africa, that is, in essence, the system that was created.
That's exactly it. That's a very good point. Yeah, just connecting it back to the international system, and realizing that not only does the situation not end up changing for any kind of in any kind of substantive way for a person living in the country where the changes being implemented are, but to the extent that there is an increase in your quality of life, that misery is quite literally being sent elsewhere. So it never really changed, who it was happening to. Just ends up having a transformation depending on different relations. So yeah, that's a really strong point you brought up there. Dread Hampton, what's good, comrade?
I was looking at the portion where they said the capitalists flung themselves into revolutions in Europe in 18th and 19th centuries to break the old relations of production. I assume that they were probably talking about the U.S. Revolution and probably the French Revolution as well. But I didn't, I had seen some things where some people have described it as revolution, and that, the merchant class replaced the royalty, and some described it as not a revolution because the working class people or non-bourgeoisie of the time didn't really get any material changes, and I didn't know what this author was saying when they meant revolutions. Were they saying that there was change for like the kind of revolution that we're seeking, or was he meaning just merchants to royals? I didn't know if he meant it in the same context.
That's a good point. I'm gonna want to look more into that to see exactly, because I want to know if there were any revolutions going on at the time that they might have been referring to more specifically. You're talking about this part here where they say the capitalists flung themselves into revolutions in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries to break the old relations of production, right?
Yeah.
I want to read more into that. That's if we're talking about the 18th and 19th centuries, we're talking about stuff like the Paris Commune, and as you mentioned, the American Revolution. But those are like kind of the not the Paris Commune, but the French Revolution itself, and what was going on with Paris later.
Yeah, that's why I was confused, because I was like, it seemed like he's saying the capitalists, like Eleonora said, he's saying the capitalists flung themselves into revolutions in Europe, and I get that, but I didn't know if he felt like a revolution in the sense of what the Paris Commune was trying to do was worth using the same word as what the Americans did.
Exactly. I do remember in the Essentials of Leninism chapter for the national question, written by Stalin, of course, he was talking about how there does come a times when the bourgeois construct and the bourgeois revolution is itself just a revolution where the reactionaries are the ones trying to overthrow the bourgeois. So he was talking about this idea that, like, depending on the context, it could be, a bourgeois system of government that is undergoing colonialism itself from outside aggressors, and that might be worth support. But then he was also talking about how, like, even in a situation like that, you might necessarily need to be making sure that the people are still agitating toward more progressive change. So even though you might temporarily be in support of something like, for example, an American Revolution, and it is, in the strictest sense of the word, revolutionary, it is still at the same time not to be confused with something like the February and October revolutions, for example, of 1917. And so revolutions themselves can take on different contexts depending on who the aggressor is and what kind of and who's fighting back against what. So that's a important point to consider as well. Let's see. Who else was on the stack? I think that's it. So I think he was referring to merchants royals because he specifically points out they are capitalist revolutions. Even saying the capitalists, though, that is a good question. I'm not 100% sure. TL, we're going to be reading this every Tuesday at noon EST. It's not in the schedule chat because this is me opening up my private reading time to spend some time with you comrades, which is good shit by me, but it won't be in the schedule. So yeah, I'll pin it here just so people can check and remember. But yeah, it's going to be every Tuesday at noon, and we're going to make sure to edit the audio so that people who miss it can join in on the reading and the discussion if they want to. And if anybody has a problem with themselves, their voice being recorded, let me know and we can edit out anything that y'all would want to be edited out. That ain't no problem. Let's see. Cursory Wikipedia of Age of Revolution in the 18th, 19th century. The Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, the Circassian Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, United Irishmen's Rebellion, Serbian Revolution, Latin America Wars of Independence, Greek War of Independence, Revolutions of 1820, 1830, and 1848, the Eureka Rebellion, the Taping Revolution, and Eleonora has single-handedly just robbed me of the rest of my afternoon once this session is done, because I'm going to be reading about all that shit now. Thanks for that, comrade. All right, Comrade Gonzalo, you want to take over for a little bit, my friend?
Sure. Thank you.
No problem.
While all societies have experienced development, it is equally true that the rate of development differed from continent to continent, and within each continent, different parts increased their command over nature at different rates. Inside Africa, Egypt was capable of producing wealth in abundance 25 centuries ago because of mastery of many scientific natural laws and their invention of technology to irrigate, grow food, and extract minerals from subsoil. At the same time, hunting with bows and even wooden clubs was what the people depended on for survival in most parts of the African continent and in various other places such as the British Isles. One of the most difficult questions to answer is exactly why different peoples developed at different rates when left on their own. Part of the answer lies in the environment in which human groups evolved, and part of it lies in the superstructure of human society. That is to say, as human beings battled with the material environment, they created forms of social relations, forms of government, patterns of behavior, and systems of belief which together constituted the superstructure, which was never exactly the same in any two societies. Each element in the superstructure interacted with other elements in the superstructure as well as with the material base. For instance, the political and religious patterns affected each other and were often intertwined. The religious belief that a certain forest was sacred was the kind of element in the superstructure that affected economic activity, since the forest would not be cleared for cultivation. So in the final analysis of its breakthrough to a new stage of human development, is dependent upon man's technical capacity to deal with the environment. It is also to be borne in mind that peculiarities in the superstructure of any given society have a marked impact on the rate of development. Many observers have been puzzled by the fact that China never became capitalist. It entered the feudal phase of development virtually 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. It had developed many aspects of technology, and it had many craftsmen and artisans. Yet the mode of production was never transformed to one where the machines were the main means of producing wealth, and where the owners of capital would be the dominant class. The explanation is very complex, but in general terms, the main differences between feudal Europe and feudal China lay in the superstructure, i.e., the body of beliefs, motivations, and socio-political institutions which derived from the material base but in turn affected it. In China, religious, educational, and bureaucratic qualifications were of utmost importance, and government was in the hands of state officials rather than being run by the landlords on their own feudal estates. Besides, there were greater egalitarian tendencies in Chinese land distribution than in European land distribution, and the Chinese state owned a great deal of land. The consequence was that the landowners had greater powers as bureaucrats than as men of property, and they used that to keep social relations in the same mold. It would have been impossible for them to have done that indefinitely, but they slowed down the movement of history. In Europe, the elements of change were not stifled by the weight of state bureaucracy. As soon as the first capitalists appeared in European society, incentive was created for further development through the attitude of this class. Never before in any human society had a group of people seen themselves consciously functioning in order to make the maximum profit out of production. To fulfill their objective of acquiring more and more capital, capitalists took a greater interest in the laws of science, which could be harnessed in the form of machinery, work and make profit on their behalf. At the political level, capitalism was also responsible for most of the features which today are referenced to as Western democracy. In abolishing feudalism, the capitalists insisted on parliaments, constitutions, freedom of the press, etc. These two could be considered as development. However, the peasants and workers of Europe, eventually the inhabitants of the whole world, paid a huge price so that the capitalists could make their profits from the human labor that always lies behind the machines. that contradicts other facets of development, especially viewed from the standpoint of those who suffered and still suffer to make capitalist achievements possible. This latter group are the majority of mankind. To advance, they must overthrow capitalism, and that is why, at the moment, capitalism stands in the path of further human social development. To put it another way, the social class relations of capitalism are now outmoded, just as slave and feudal relations became outmoded in their time. There was a period when the capitalist system increased the well-being of significant numbers of people as a byproduct of seeking out profits for a few. Today, the quest for profits come into a sharp conflict with people's demands that their material and social needs should be fulfilled. The capitalist or bourgeois class is no longer capable of guiding the uninhibited development of science and technology again because these objectives now clash with the profit motive. Capitalism has proved incapable of transcending fundamental weaknesses such as underutilization of productive capacity, persistence of a permanent sector of unemployed, and periodic economic crisis related to the concept of market, which is concerned with the people's ability to pay rather than their need for commodities. Capitalism has created its own irrationalities such as vicious white racism, tremendous waste associated with advertising, and the irrationality of incredible poverty in the midst of wealth and wastage, even inside the biggest capitalist economies, such as that of the USA. Above all, capitalism has intensified its own political contradictions in trying to subjugate nations and continents outside of Europe, so that workers and peasants in every part of the globe have become self-conscious and are determined to take their destiny into their own hands. Such a determination is also an integral part of the process of development.
Thank you, comrade. Did you have any thoughts you wanted to share before Saber goes on?
They can go ahead.
Appreciate it. All right. What's good, Saber?
Yeah, I just had a small thing to add that came to mind when the comrade read the line that says the capitalist or bourgeois class is no longer capable of guiding the uninhibited development of science and technology again because these objectives now clash with the profit motive. I think the most poignant example of that is in regards to things like planned obsolescence just in general, and how, despite the technological capabilities to for instance, extend battery life in phones or whatever, companies like Apple have intentionally weakened their batteries over time to encourage people to buy phones every year, things like that. And you can only imagine how much better things would be if we actually just focused on making the best product possible, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Oftentimes, I think about it from the standpoint of these modern day game systems. Are they only ever giving us the best counsel, for example, that they can conceive of, or are they holding back on ideas, knowing that if they do hold back on an idea and they put it up against the previous system, they can look that much better, even though they definitely could have just gone ahead and developed that a generation ago if they wanted to. And you can extend this way of thinking in terms of capitalism and how they constantly, quite literally underdevelop the goods in order to make sure that they have something that they can sell later and produce later. And you think about it from the standpoint that, they're doing this, but they're also calling themselves innovators. It starts to quickly become clear how they're propagandizing us to believe that this system is fair. Look at these brilliant capitalists who are constantly innovating and thinking about ideas. Such and such wasn't possible 5 years ago, but now, we have it, even though such and such was possible, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. This is how, they quite literally justify, like you were saying, just quite literally not making good shit while at the same time pretending, that they're making the best shit that, humans are capable of making. So that's a really good point that you brought up, comrade. So Ziva said, I think the relationship between base and superstructure that Rodney talks about is really helpful to understanding uneven development, but so is external pressure on these systems. like the strength of certain worker protections in the Nordic model or other areas in Europe. These benefits are a result of exploiting the global south, of course, but they are also the result of works of states granting concessions to workers in order to avoid the communist threat. That's absolutely true. We have example right here in the U.S. of these so-called New Deal concessions that were meant to put down the very real revolutionary energy that was surging through the country in the late 1920s and through the 30s that were put out there just to make sure that communism never took hold. FDR quite literally talked about doing the New Deal in order to save capitalism. So why the soap dems look to him as some sort of progressive hero is beyond me. And then you take a look at some of the context, some of these so-called concessions, some of these so-called negotiations, and to the extent they can, they're still trying to make sure certain colonized peoples end up deprived of the gains. So black veterans having a harder time getting access to the so-called benefits of the GI Bill. Black people not getting for a while the benefits of Medicaid and Social Security, shit like that. These are very real material things that are happening while these things are being developed, and at the same time, you're sold it as progress and like, look how the capitalists are looking out for you. It's very not only exploitative, it's just very transparent on how they sell you a story so that you end up having more faith in a system that has no intention on taking care of you. So yeah, that's some good shit. That's some good discussion y'all are fostering. What's Eleonora saying? Let's take a look. RE gain systems, phones, etc. Either consider how technology on this level is a tool that generates further revenue beyond the labor required to generate it. Software is a non-tangible product of mental labor. It can be sold, and it generates an industry that spans STEM fields as something you should be enthusiastic to participate in without care for how much you are actually engaging beyond what is useful for your exploitation. Yeah, this is true. And then when you think about it from the standpoint of people are quite literally getting their needs met through, what's the word I'm looking for? Through using this very same technology to themselves try to carve out a niche in this capitalist world for themselves in a way that they can get their material needs met. You start to see how overly reliant we are on the way the technology is in the one place, in the first place. So yeah, that's a strong point, comrade. Yeah, give me a second, y'all. Alrighty, there we go. So yeah, let me see the chat real quick. Saber is totally right. We will see the perspective. We also see this perspective in the COVID vaccine patent issue now. While previously capitalist countries did have investment in ensuring people are vaccinated, the profit motive now overpowers that public good. We also see this invented scarcity as patents prevent countries in the global south from getting the vaccine, while countries like the U.S. buy all the available vaccines. That's a really strong point, Ziva. I remember when they were first talking about getting a patent for this COVID vaccine. The dialogue going around was how do we know we can trust it? How do we know it's safe, etc. How do we know they're just not trying to test it out on us before they give it to the people who they really want to have it? And I remember thinking to myself at the time, and it's fucked up that we live in a world where this would even be a thing to enter a person's thought, but it's very real. But I remember that they were talking about specifically not allowing it to go to Nigeria and other countries in Africa until 2023. And I remember thinking to myself, well, shit, if they're intentionally trying to keep it out of the hands of Africans, then it must be something that's actually worth having, as opposed to typically when it's something that is actually harmful, they always, try to circulated through Africa and other underdeveloped and exploited countries first. So, yeah, that's a stronger point than what you were even saying there. Unfortunately, Fieldy says, "Planned obsolescence." Want to call back to this quote from a few pages back. In the history of these societies, which have passed through several modes of production, the opportunity is presented of seeing how quantitative changes quite give rise ultimately to an entirely different society. The key feature is that at given junctures, the social relations in a society were no longer effective in promoting advance. Indeed, they begin to act as brakes on the productive forces and therefore had to be discarded. Exactly. They'll quite literally, they'll scrap a system in a moment the moment they see that the system that they have in place at the moment is no longer serving the profit motive and no longer able to fuel advancement in a way that keeps their relation to labor and what they see as the dominant position. That's why we see examples of like, oh yeah, I can definitely, what he was talking about earlier, give these slaves so-called freedom because they're going to be free and find that they still have to come back into exploitative relationship in the first place. It's all kind of connected like that, unfortunately. A conversion of social capital to monetary capital. Exactly. Social media is a great example. We create further isolation and package it as a solution. Then we sell solutions to the solutions. Yeah, that's real. Oh, we're isolated. Let's give you social media, which will isolate you further. Then let's promote all these different ideas for alternatives to social media that are also owned by the same companies telling you to get on social media in the first place so that you don't feel isolated, which in itself then creates further isolation as you feel like you don't even have access to the so-called solutions to the solutions. So yeah, it's not even subtle how they operate. Saber, you were saying you wanted to read for a little bit, comrade.
Yeah. Let me.
Yep.
I can share my screen as well in case anyone wants to follow along.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It can be offered as a generalization that all phases of development are temporary or transient and are destined sooner or later to give way to something else. It is particularly important to stress this with reference to capitalism because the capitalist epoch is not quite over, and those who live at a particular point in time often fail to see that their way of life is in the process of transformation and elimination. Indeed, it is one of the functions of those who justify capitalism, bourgeois writers, to try and pretend that capitalism is here to stay. A glance at the remarkable advance of socialism over the last 50-odd years will show that the apologists for capitalism are spokesmen of a social system that is rapidly expiring. The fact that capitalism today is still around alongside of socialism should warn us that the modes of production cannot simply be viewed as a question of uneven development has always ensured that societies have come into contact when they were at different levels. For example, one that was communal and one that was capitalist. When two societies of different sorts come into prolonged and effective contact, the rate and character of change taking place in both is seriously affected to the extent that entirely new patterns are created. Two general rules can be observed to apply in such cases. Firstly, the weaker of the two societies, i.e. the one with less economic capacity, is bound to be adversely affected, and the bigger the gap between the two societies concerned, the more detrimental are the consequences. For example, when European capitalism came into contact with the indigenous hunting societies of America and the Caribbean, the latter were virtually exterminated. Secondly, assuming that the weaker society does survive, then ultimately it can resume its own independent development only if it proceeds to a higher level than that of the economy which had previously dominated it. The concrete instances of the operation of this second rule are found in the existence of the Soviet Union, China, and Korea. China and Korea were both at a stage approximating the feudalism when they were colonized by the capitalist powers of Europe and Japan. Russia was never legally colonized, but while in the feudal stage and before its own indigenous capitalism could get very far, the Russian economy was subjugated by the more mature capitalism of Western Europe. In all three cases, it took a socialist revolution to break the domination of capitalism, and only the rapid tempo of socialist development could make amends for the period of subjugation when the growth was misdirected and retarded. Indeed, as far as the two biggest socialist societies are concerned, the Soviet Union and China, socialist development has already catapulted them beyond states such as Britain and France, which have been following the capitalist path for centuries. Up to the end of the 1950s, the point at which this study terminates, Russia, China, Korea, and certain nations in Eastern Europe were the only countries which have had decisively broken with capitalism and imperialism. Imperialism is itself a phase of capitalist development in which Western Europe capitalist countries, the US and Japan, established political, economic, military, and cultural hegemony over other parts of the world, which were initially at a lower level and therefore could not resist domination. Imperialism was in effect the extended capitalist system, which for many years embraced the whole world, one part being the exploiters and the other the exploited, one part being dominated and the others acting as overlords, one part making policy and the other being dependent. Socialism has advanced on imperialism's weakest flanks. In the sector that is exploited, oppressed, and reduced to dependency. In Asia and Eastern Europe, socialism released the nationalist energies of colonized peoples. It turned the gold production away from the money market and towards the satisfaction of human needs. It eradicated bottlenecks such as permanent unemployment and periodic crises. And it has realized some of the promise implicit in Western or bourgeois democracy by providing the equality of economic condition, which is necessary before one can make use of political equality and equality before the law. Socialism has reinstated the economic equality of communalism, but communalism fell apart because of the low economic productivity and scarcity. Socialism aims at and has significantly achieved the creation of plenty, so that the principle of egalitarian distribution becomes consistent with the satisfaction of the wants of all members of society. One of the most crucial factors leading to more rapid and consistent expansion of economic capacity on socialism has been the implementation of planned development. Most of the historical processes so far described relate to involuntary and unplanned development. No one planned that at a given stage, human beings should cease using stone axes and use iron implements instead. And to come to more recent times, while individual capitalist firms plan their own expansion, their system is not geared to overall planning of the economy and the society. The capitalist state intervened only fitfully and partially to supervise capitalist development. The socialist state has as its prime function the control of the economy on behalf of the working class. The latter, i.e. workers and peasants, have now become the most dynamic force in world history and human development. To conclude this brief introduction to the extremely complex problem of social development, it is useful to recognize how inadequate are the explanations of the phenomenon which are provided by bourgeois scholars. They seldom try to grapple with the issue in its totality, but rather concentrate attention narrowly on quote-unquote economic development, as defined by the average bourgeois economist. Development becomes simply a matter of the combination of given quote-unquote factors of production, namely land, population, capital, technology, specialization, and large-scale production. Those factors are indeed relevant, as is implied in the analysis so far, but omissions from the list of what bourgeois scholars think relevant are really overwhelming. No mention is made of the exploitation of the majority, which underlay all development prior to socialism. No mention is made of the social relations of production or classes. No mention is made of the way that the factors and relations of production combine to form a distinctive system or mode of production, varying from one historical epoch to another. I like how he also makes the point that, like, whilst you're living under a particular system, namely capitalism, which is what we live under today, it is like very, very hard to kind of step outside of that and to not see it as the norm, especially if you've been born into that kind of system and, you know, like a few generations that you can look back or even forward, you see nothing but capitalism. And that kind of speaks to the whole idea of like capitalist realism that people like Mark Fisher talk about, and how like people can't imagine a different system and obviously that plays out in various ways and how it's enforced in this society or whatever. But yeah, those are just a few things that kind of stood out to me, I guess.
I appreciate it, comrade. I appreciate you sharing. Must be a weird coincidence. Those parts have always been left out. Be a total coincidence, right? That's for the question. Is there a typical length of time these sessions go, or does it vary? We always schedule a block of 2 hours. So from the starting time to whenever 2 hours is up, and then sometimes we end up wrapping up shortly before the 2 hours. Sometimes we go right to the 2 hour mark, but we don't never go more than the 2 hours, which lets it kind of be a long discussion without, you know, wearing people out too much. You know, you've seen how it's been able to freely flow today, and that's typically the way it goes. It's only been Wretched of the Earth that we've read so far where we can't even get through a whole section before we have to wrap up the chapter, but that's mostly because Wretched of the Earth is long as shit. So Wretched of the Earth also has some real heavy shit that just promotes more longer discussion, I would say. So some of the things that Comrade Saber was reading here in this last section. Socialism has advanced on imperialism's weakest flanks in the sector that is exploited, oppressed, and reduced to dependency. In Asia and Eastern Europe, socialism released the nationalist energies of colonized people. It turned the goal of production away from the money market and toward the satisfaction of human needs. It has eradicated bottlenecks such as permanent unemployment and periodic crises, and it has realized some of the promise implicit in Western or bourgeois democracy by providing the equality of economic condition, which is necessary before one can make use of political equality and equality before the law. So yeah, he was talking here about socialism having advanced on imperialism's weakest flanks. And it lets you know that people-powered movements, organization itself, and changing the mode of production to something that's based on satisfying the material needs of people is something that imperialism cannot allow and cannot handle, because that very much gets in the way of the profit motive. He's talking here about the nationalist energies of colonized people. It turned the goal of production away from the money market and toward the satisfaction of human needs. This is not something that imperialism can stand in the face of. This is why it's important to remember that there are many more socialists in the world than there are capitalists when you think about a capitalist from the definitional standpoint. There's a couple billion of us, you know, and at best, depending on how you want to define it and how friendly you want to be, there's only a few million of them, so we always got to keep that in mind. Another part that was really interesting when he talks about Russia, China, Korea, and certain nations in Eastern Europe were the only countries which had decisively broken with capitalism and imperialism. And when we talk about breaking away from capitalism and imperialism, it's not that you're not yourself having to engage in a relationship that divorces you from imperialism. That's not possible as long as imperialism exists. What it's talking about is this idea of we don't have to engage in the exploitation of our people and stealing resources and coercing resources away from other countries, deteriorating relations just to be able to turn a profit motive, which are things that were achieved in these countries that were not necessarily achieved to that time in other countries. You know, you could think about countries like Laos, Cuba, Vietnam, Nicaragua starting a path towards socialism, Mozambique, Algeria, Albania, etc. You know, so there's a lot to look forward to in terms of the development of socialism in the lifetimes of the people who have joined me in this call today, even more so than at the time that How Europe Underdeveloped Africa released. So let's read Brand's thoughts. I'm thinking a lot about how Rodney's analysis highlights the errors of all kinds of bourgeois scholars and even some vulgar Marxists. He mentions the bourgeois scholars who reduce development to purely quantitative economic factors, total production and consumption. But some Marxists make similar mistakes by treating the economic base as the only cause of social development. On the other side of things, there is also the long tradition of Western bourgeois cultural chauvinism that blames underdevelopment on so-called backwards culture, placing the superstructure as the only cause of development. Rodney's analysis highlights these errors by avoiding them. He understands that base and superstructure are interdependent causative forces. That's such a real fucking point. You know, it's these class reductionists, right? These motherfuckers who are out here like, oh, no war, but the class war. You know, these motherfuckers who are out here talking about like, oh yeah, people who want to bring up like, you know, trans issues and race issues, they're just too focused on the culture war, where we need to just be focusing on the class war, as if you can divorce the social relations, you know, between the system and our LGBTQ comrades, the system and our Black and Indigenous comrades, you know, the system and our differently able comrades. These things are all interconnected. There's not going to be a revolution. There won't be socialism without, especially in the 21st century, giving due reverence to the unique and specific struggles faced by all these different marginalized communities, and then, you know, building a system that is not just doing this horseshit liberal inclusivity, but also, you know, addressing their concerns in a real material way. You know, liberalism, and it talks about it in critical race theory a little bit, is very obsessed with this human right as in the abstract, you know, the rights that we can write down on paper that don't have any basis in material reality, unless we, of course, conceive of them. Stuff like, oh, you know, the right to vote, you know, the right to due process, all these different things that were surely improvements under bourgeois democracy, but not getting to the actual base material human rights, which should be things like housing, things like access to mental health services, things like access to free education at all levels, things like access to free, food, etc. When you think about it from that standpoint, you start to think like, oh, you know, there's a clear distinction between the liberal and the socialist and what they think a right ought to even constitute. But we're concerned with the material in this material world we live in. They're concerned with the conceptual, and we don't really have time for that horseshit, quite frankly. Saber.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a little recommendation. I came across this video by Walter Rodney where he's basically talking about this, but in a very like, oh no, in a similar way to how he's describing it here, but I think it's a great speech that he gave, and I kind of wanted to just recommend that in case anyone wants to like check it out.
Yeah, link it here and we'll pin it. Ziva says that's right. Things like race, gender, sexuality are modalities through which class is expressed. They are not a total separation from class. Here, they're not a separation from class at all. Hell, capitalism develops based on these different social relations. And as a result, with these contradictions having not been resolved in society, you see the inequities that exist throughout the capitalist world. It's not at all a coincidence. So yeah, that's a very important point to make. I'm going to wrap up in a second, but before we do so, did anybody else have anything they wanted to say or questions they wanted to ask?
I have a question, I suppose.
Oh, good. What's good?
So you know how people like Rodney or just like, you know, Marxists in general talk about the various epochs of human society, and they usually talk in terms of like progression from one epoch to another and things like that. Or like as we're seeing, like even though we currently live in a system that has progress in regards to like what we're able to produce, we're seeing that like in regards to, you know, the other side of it in terms of like the environmental destruction side of things, and how climate change is kind of basically like intrinsically linked to, or just environmental degradation in general is kind of linked to capitalist incentives or lack thereof, I guess. So I suppose that my question is, would you still consider that to be progress when you kind of look at the system in its totality from, say, for example, indigenous societies that have been living in very sustainable ways for like thousands of years and stuff like that?
That's a good question, comrade. At that point, we have to figure out an objective definition for what progress ought to mean. But of course, right at the beginning, Rodney's talking about bourgeois subjectivity and any kind of definition of progress. So from the standpoint of like, is that progress for like, for example, our indigenous comrades? I mean, there's 4 million of our indigenous comrades left between Canada and the U.S. due to colonialism. I would argue that obviously from their perspective, and from mine as well, and most people in this chat, it's not progress at all. If we're only ever going to look at things from the technological standpoint, from the means of production standpoint, you can talk about progress. But Rodney is making a clear argument for how we can't divorce the social relations from progress and from our understanding of what development even is. And at the end of the day, indigenous comrades still exist. So if there isn't land back, that's not progress. If there isn't a total reparations bill that gives due reverence to the brutality of slavery to the descendants of slavery, that's not progress. If there isn't, quite literally, socialism in this country, then that's not progress at all. So no, I don't think from the Marxist point of view, at the end of the day, we've achieved what can be meaningfully considered progress if we're going to give reverence to the fact that the social development and the social relation itself has to be considered when you're talking about what progress even means. Because if we're only going to let the bourgeois define it, then society is as good as it's ever been. But obviously, we're not going to fucking do that. Now, if you're talking about have things changed, are there more efficient, productive capacities? Yeah, but what does that even mean? And what's the point of that if they're not in the hands, of the working people, so that we can actually control the mode of production in the way that actually makes all this technological, productive progress work for us instead of benefit some fucking capitalist motherfucker who doesn't have our interest in mind at all. So that's kind of how I fall on that, comrade.
Cool. Yeah, I appreciate that answer.
Problem, big dog. Maybe progress is another word for change rather than a subjective positive word, a matter of moving away from a previous method of social relation. But if we're just literally talking about progress as a straight line from one system to another and not thinking of it as are things better, then then you can answer this question from a totally different angle. It's not a positive or negative word. I suppose it just depends on the context in which you're talking about progress. So that's a good point too. So next week we'll be reading 23 pages. We stopped at 1.2. What is underdevelopment? Section 1.1 was what is development. Next week will be what is underdevelopment, and we'll be discussing that. So I'm looking forward to doing that with y'all. If you join just for the Walter Rodney, but you want to be here for other stuff, we're meeting Mondays at 8 p.m. EST, and we're finishing up Wretched of the Earth. So I think that's only going to be another 2 or 3 sessions for that. After that, we'll be taking a short break from the Monday night readings to do a couple of presentations. I'll be doing a DPRK presentation, and another comrade has a presentation he'll be doing as well. After that, though, we'll be starting Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, which is a very important work everybody should read. Wednesdays soon we'll be starting Women Racing Class by Angela Davis, and we're continuing. We only got 3 chapters left, but this Saturday at 5 EST we're continuing Blackshirts and Reds, and then after that we'll be moving on to Inventing Reality. So there's a lot. If you want to participate in other discussions, there's a lot to do and start. And we didn't get Craig in here to record discussions until this one, but going forward all of our book discussions will be recorded. So even if y'all miss when you want to catch it later in the discussion, you'll be able to do that. So that'll start with probably Inventing Reality, which we'll most likely get to before Neocolonialism. But depending on which one of those we get to next, that'll be the next one that we start recording. Are all the groups in this same format, reading together and discussing? Fieldy, they're all in this format. And the reason we do it that way is because we have a lot of our comrades who are differently abled who have expressed that this is the only way they can get any reading done at all. And so I decided there's enough groups for people who want to read ahead of time and then discuss it. We need something for people who are quite literally reading, together on the fly, and they don't have to feel pressure to, read ahead of time. So that's why we do it this way. It's been pretty heavily debated on whether we should go to the other format or not. But for as long as I'm running the server, we're going to keep it this way. The use of progress is so loaded by centuries of use by European capitalist thinkers to be synonymous with the kind of formal emancipation from hierarchical systems, slavery, feudalism, capitalism. That's a perfect point, Bran. And we can wrap it up there. So it was good reading with y'all. If y'all are interested, I hope y'all are joining us Monday nights, Wednesday nights, and Saturday afternoons for those discussions. Other than that, I'm always around if you ever want to shoot the shit about theory or anything else really. Good spending time with y'all. I'll see y'all next Tuesday at 12 EST for chapter 1.2 or section 1.2, what is underdevelopment. Until then, You comrades, take care. I'll see y'all around.
All right. See you later.
Better comrade.
Have a good one.
Bye.